Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome to the State Library for the first of our New Look Disrupted Festival of Ideas events. So before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you need the toilets, they're to my left over there, and in the case of emergency, please follow the instructions from library staff. You can see them with their disrupted t-shirts on, but we'll make ourselves known. We do have a Twitter hashtag if you'd like to tweet and share your thoughts on social media, and the hashtag is disrupted21. So we'd like to begin this evening with a welcome to country, and we're very pleased to have May Maguire here to do that for us this evening. So welcome to May.
Thanks, love, for thanks, my dear, for the welcome. Kaya yarn by Yorks, moms. And Europe niti wangin, wanju nunuk nila, ala puja, ngala nunga puja. Kura ngala dimanga mamanga in barning niti. Ngan mort, kora. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to be standing here and welcoming you to the lands of the Noongar people in the Wajak district of Perth, which is Burla. We call Perth Burla. And kora meaning a long time ago. My ancestors lived here in this district, in this same area here as we're standing. And many of them. My father was born in Guildford, and the great grannies all were born under Kings Park. And so I'm a proud person to be a direct descendant to the dear old people. When you talk about poverty, us Noongar people have all been through that. Going to school, I remember going to school without shoes. And my little brother, sometimes I used to have to carry him on my back because it was so cold in the winter that he had no shoes on. Mum would buy him shoes and he'd take them off to play and run and whatever, and he'd lose them, and just about every week Mum would have to get him a new shoe again. It wasn't a brand new shoe. We'd go to a second-hand shop or like Salvo's or something and get it there for him. And so not only that, our poverty line was with food as well. If the dad didn't have a job, you didn't have food in the house too often. But mum knew how to have a meal on the table at the end of the day. She would go and catch a rabbit or a duck or something to keep us going, you know, and duck eggs, stuff like that, and that would keep us going for days on end. And they'd make the dampers, and we'd have damper with no butter, of course. It was all dipped in dripping or fat or something, you know, to keep it from being dry, and that was our sandwich. So, and at the convent where we went to, they used to have little ice blocks for us as well, and they were quite a help as well. Sometimes we had one of my old aunties used to come around with a van with nice second-hand clothes, and used to bring them out to my mum and give them to mum for me and my little brother and herself. And we were right. We was happy to have some new. I used to be happy for a new little dress. It looked new to me, but it was second hand. So yes, so poverty was hard when it was in my childhood days, especially when it came to clothing yourself and having food on the table. Because times there wasn't much work for our people around the district, and you couldn't get food unless you had money. But the farmers around there helped us out as much as possible as well. So, but yeah, poverty is a hard thing for a lot of people in every society. Every one of us goes through that stage. Not just my culture, not just my people, but everyone. When I sit down and look at the little ad that's on television about the school kids, a little schoolgirl going to school and a little boy, that reminds me of my days at school. We never had books, good books or thing. They'd give us a little piece of paper to write on, and where the little paper went to after we finished writing on it, we don't know. Never got any results back or anything like that. So yeah, I hope that everything goes well tonight. God will bless the evening. I know that for sure. And as He's blessed us all these years, He's blessed me all my life, me and my family. So once again, ngalak jinang nunak berdoan. Nitjabal jinang nunak, bar jinang ngan all the time. May the Great One above look after you, keep you safe, as He always keeps me safe. And I will see you another day. Thank you all, and thanks Karina for having us here and the rest of the mob. So yeah, God bless.
Thank you, May, for that welcome to country. And I would also like to acknowledge that we meet tonight on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to elders, and to acknowledge their strength in the face of a great deal of difficulty over many, many years. State Library's Disrupted Festival of Ideas is now in its 8th year, which is quite amazing, really, when I think about it. Disrupted began as an idea to highlight the role of libraries as places that enable the exploration of ideas, of places that can challenge the status quo, but that can also inspire change and innovation, as well as being probably what we're most traditionally known as, and that is a place of knowledge and books. And so the festival's become quite a regular fixture in many calendars. Libraries around the world not only prioritise access to information, but we also provide equal and inclusive access to knowledge and information. And these form part of our core values. And inclusivity sometimes means listening to ideas and voices that we'd rather not hear, because sometimes they can be painful or difficult. But as libraries, we aim to provide a balanced and somewhat neutral approach to our programming and also to our collections. Quite deliberately, it doesn't mean that minority voices are silenced. In fact, quite the contrary. Libraries give these voices a platform to be heard. So Disrupted is our free event, and it's one of the platforms that we use to help engage the Western Australian community in ideas and different perspectives. Tonight we're live streaming, and I'd like to welcome those people that have joined us via the live streaming. And through this we engage people across Western Australia, but for past events we've had audiences as far away as South Africa and Romania. So regardless of where people live, they can engage in the ideas, in the discussion and in the conversation. So tonight we're focusing on change. Actually, sorry, this year we're focusing on change. This last year's been characterised by so many changes, I think it's hard to even contemplate, and we've just adapted to them because we've had to. And so Disrupted is changing in itself. We're moving to this new format, this monthly format, partly because of COVID, because we don't quite know what the next months will bring, and I think Brisbane's a really current example of how one day things can be one way and the next day it'll be changed. So as we know, change is probably the only constant that we have in our lives right now. So we've changed the way in which we deliver Disrupted, and we've got monthly events throughout the year. We're still considering a weekend event at the end of the year, but I think we'll think about that a little bit further on. We've only released the program for the first few months, for the first couple of sessions, sorry, but we have quite a few in development. So you can follow the program on our website or on social media or subscribe to our newsletter. So before we begin, I'll just a little plug for our next two events. The next one is on Tuesday the 27th of April, where period Queen Lucy Peach will discuss Going with the Flow together with Andrea Gibbs. And our third event is on Tuesday the 25th of May, which will explore the topic of assisted dying, which is quite topical as the changes to the legislation kick in the middle of the year. But without any further ado, I'm going to ask Geraldine Mellett to come to the podium and introduce tonight's session, Poverty in Western Australia, What Needs to Change? Thanks.
And thank you so much for coming to this session, whether you're here in person or whether you are online. Thank you very much, Margaret, and I wanted to say congratulations for disrupting your own Disrupted Festival, which I thought was pretty cool, by keeping it going in a different format. And kudos to you as well for putting your spotlight onto poverty right here in our community and what needs to change. In my mind, I don't know about yours, but Disrupted has always had a really negative connotation. You know, someone was disrupting a meeting, they're always creating a problem or whatever. And then Uber came along, and I realised that Disrupted sort of changed itself in the meaning, and suddenly in business meetings and wherever else I went, people were talking about how to disrupt, you know, the whatever innovation they had. That was the key word. So I think it has changed somewhat. Tonight we're going to keep that word in our mind during our discussion about changing what's not working in current approaches to poverty here in WA, particularly as we face another wave. It is amazing to be talking about this at the time that JobKeeper has ended, at the time the rent moratorium has ended, and we face what I'm hearing is a whole nother wave of homelessness. We have some really excellent people tonight with all kinds of relevant experience and great minds to throw these things up in the air and to talk about fresh approaches. Just to let you know how we've structured it this evening, we're going to hear from the people behind 100 Families first. We're going to watch a video with some people with lived experience, and then we're going to hear about the research that underpins this project. And that's after that we'll have, I'm really sorry about that, we'll have the panel to toss things around. I do promise that I will put the microphone over to you at some point. So if you've got questions, if you've got comments, if you've got experiences, we would love to hear them. But if you can just hang on to them till that point in the panel conversation, I promise to release my very deathly grip on the microphone and hand it over. First of all, though, let's hear from someone who is succeeding in disrupting high-level conversations about these issues by what seems like such a basic concept, and yet one that couldn't be more important: listening to people with lived experience and finding a way to get their voices to the decision project. And of course, I'm talking about the 100 Families project here in WA. Alex Hughes is the project manager. He's the man with the buck stops here sign on his desk. And he knows the social service sector from the inside out. He's got over 13 years experience working for the Department of Communities and for not-for-profits in the design and delivery of services delivery. In the design and service of delivery of services. as well as in research-focused roles. Would you give him a nice warm welcome? Thank you.
You can hear me? Good, good. So yeah, my name is Alex Hughes. I'm the project manager. I'll start firstly by saying a thank you to Auntie May Maguire, and also acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land, Whadjuk land, the Noongar Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past and those emerging. So, well, thank you for coming tonight. It's good that you're here, otherwise we'd be speaking to some empty chairs, so that's a good start. There's lots of you here, and I'm sure there's lots of you online as well. Thank you to the library for agreeing to host us, and thanks to Lottery West for being the principal funder of this project. So, you might be wondering, what is 100 Families WA? So I'm going to give you a quick 5-minute pitch and let you know what that is before throwing to a video, which I think will set the tone better than I can. So 100 Families WA is a collaborative action research project. So the collaborative part being there's 10 partners. The research part being we're here to learn, and the action part is we're here to do, to change. Now, the reason the project exists is because a few years ago, people came together within the sector, community service sector, and understood that what we're doing isn't working. People who are experiencing poverty or something we call entrenched disadvantage are staying entrenched, they're staying stuck. So whatever we're doing as charities, as services, isn't working. It's maintaining their stuckness, if you like. So, what do we need to do? Well, the first thing to do is to listen. We need to start listening to those people. Now, some people say, or maybe don't know what the level of poverty is here in Australia or here in Western Australia. People might say there is no poverty. Everyone's doing fine. When you look on the TV in other countries, they're in a lot worse positions. Well, there is poverty. You obviously been watching the news, you've seen some of the outcomes for some of the families, and it's getting worse, especially after the coronavirus pandemic. Currently, 250,000 people in Western Australia are in poverty. Poverty, by the way, if you're not sure, is measured by 50 or 60% of median income. So if you're receiving that or less, you're in poverty. And when I say entrenched disadvantage, we talk about it in broader terms. So poverty can be financial poverty, but it can be food poverty, it can be digital poverty. A growing issue is social isolation, a lot of people alone. And it can be material deprivation, not having access to the resources that make your basic human needs met. So what we did is start listening. So we started engaging actually 400 families, a bit of a branding issue. We started with 100 families, we ended up with 400 families, which is good. We didn't change our name. 400 families every year for a longitudinal survey. So that's a survey when they catch up with their interviewer that lasts between an hour and 2 hours, depending on how much they talk. It's a really, really deep engagement. We also threw in, when coronavirus pandemic happened, an additional survey to capture their experience there, which I know Professor Paul Flateau is going to talk to in a minute. We went further though. We selected randomly 100 of those 400 people, and we met with them every 2 weeks for a whole year to engage them on the things that they wanted to talk to us about. There were some specific things we needed to know, but it was an open engagement, and they told us what they're experiencing. Some of the things that are working, some of the things that are not working, some of the things that could work. And through their stories, through their experiences, we start to see a picture that should have existed a long time ago, to be honest. But one thing we're not always great at doing is listening. So that's what we're doing. This is a listening project, but not just a listening project. It's a doing project. We want to get this information out there. So it's not traditional research in terms of publications, etc. We don't want anything to sit on a dusty shelf. We want to get the information out. So the things on your seats tonight, that was a snapshot. That's a one-pager. We have lots of those on the website. We also put out videos, reports, that kind of thing. But we're trying to get the message out there that poverty exists and these are people's experiences. And what we need to do now is change. So I encourage you, if you're moved by any of this tonight, if you're interested in hearing more, go onto the website, 100familieswa.org.au. You can put your email address in. You'll get a newsletter every 3 months. And as we head towards June, which is when our full report is launched, you'll start to hear more about what you could do as general public, you know, to make a change, to make a difference. Now, as I said, we're going to throw to a video now. So this is the Speaking from Experience series. We set this up 10 months ago, just as coronavirus hit in Western Australia. Basically because we wanted information to be out there, but also we felt within the media, within public discourse, there was a change. People were talking about poverty differently, or hardship, whatever we want to call it. People firsthand were knowing family members or friends who were impacted by losing jobs, going on to Job Seeker. Suddenly, New Start, previously called, now Job Seeker, those people were talked about differently. And so we wanted to capitalize on that empathy and make sure the information was out there. So people know, okay, yep, there's new people, but there's people who are stuck as well, and they want just the same things as us, just the same things as you, and these are their experiences. So with that, I'm going to throw to Renna and Kira. I think they'll be coming up on this screen, in the Speaking from Experience video called Poverty and Finances. Thank you.
The idea that all people who are poor deserve to be because they don't try hard enough, you know, they've had every opportunity and they haven't made anything of it. I think it's a lie.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
A lie. If you're in hardship, why do you keep going into debt? That'll be those bills.
Those bills.
Yeah, those bills. To be honest, I think debt applies to most people.
Absolutely.
I think if you don't have a payday loan, you've got a credit card.
Exactly.
And I think that's almost regardless of how much money you're earning.
Being in hardship and then having struggle and, you know, car breaking down, like where does this money come from? Like I don't have the money, so then, you know, cash convert a loan or something, and then I'm in more debt. And it's just
Payday lenders are the worst. It's a lot of interest.
Absolutely.
I just paid off debts that I incurred back when my partner died 6 years ago, and now I'm going to uni, so I'm building up my next lot of debt.
Exactly.
Yeah, debt.
Can't you budget your bills so you don't fall behind?
I do budget my bills. I'm precision budgeting. I think when you're living on very limited income, you find a way. I go without lots of other things.
You know, when you don't have much of a budget, you don't really have a choice, but you have to budget, you know, like, okay, I have this much for food and this much for bills, you know, that I could put away. So it's not easy.
No, it's hugely stressful, but I know from past experience that I can't afford to not have shelter.
Yeah.
I can't afford to not have my power on. I can't afford to not have my gas on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I budget.
You say you can't afford food, but you have a phone, car, TV, etc.
So I do have a phone, and more recently I have a car,
Yeah.
which is how I'm able to be in society. If I didn't have a phone, I wouldn't have connection with anybody, especially now we're in Corona.
Yeah.
If I didn't have my internet, I wouldn't be able to study. And I only had my car for about the last year because it became apparent that I couldn't do more, be more, give more if I wasn't able to get around. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
Like you said, that connection, we live in a society where technology is so, like, needed. Do you know what I mean? Like, you can't contact anyone. Like, no one writes letters anymore, you know, like that's not how we communicate, you
And
know,
the
you
last
pick
few
up the
months
phone.
you can't go to the doctor. You
Exactly.
have to do a telehealth.
Exactly.
What happens if you don't have a phone?
Exactly.
Internet.
You can't go to a phone box to do that.
That's right. And unfortunately, doing that on a small budget, sometimes I can't afford food.
Yeah, that's it. What is the biggest lie told to people in hardship?
Oh, that's a good one. What does Scott Morrison say? You have a go, you'll get a go. You have a go, you'll get a go. Says a man who's had everything handed to him since birth.
Yeah.
I think that is, for me, that's the one, you know. If people succeeded based on their merit and the effort that they put in, then damn, we'd be rich, wouldn't we? We'd be very successful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think it is the same for everyone. There is definitely more hurdles depending on, you know, what's your sexuality, you know, your gender, your race, your where you've come from. Yeah, there are definitely barriers that need to be overcome, and I think that I still don't think that enough people understand that really. I think that people still believe that, anyone can make it because here's this one person I can pluck out of that 1,000 and that one person I can pluck out of that 1,000 that came from nothing and have made everything. Yeah. Believe you me, they did that in spite of, not because of the support that they were given. It's like winning the lottery. It honestly is.
Absolutely.
I know so many people that have just tried and tried and tried, and it's just been, you know, so many barriers and hurdles that they can't overcome, compounded with, you know, lack of opportunities, compounded with really bad luck. You know, like I know people who try the hardest and still end up with cancer, or something happens and then something happens and then something happens. Yeah.
You know, like you have AOD, you have mental health, you have all of this stuff, and then you have stigma on top of that, and it's just like, you know, not everyone has it that easy, and not everyone's journey or path is the same.
I think it's a fairy tale that that anyone's immune either. It's literally like your partner dying, you know, something happening, a loss of a job could cause a loss of a mortgage, a loss of, you know, like nobody's immune to things that just start to tumble. I know lots of people that find themselves, particularly since Corona, now in a situation that they could have never foreseen, they could have never planned for, and that they can't see a way they're going to get out of.
Exactly. Like so many people have lost their jobs, and, you know, one day they're happily in a job that they've really built that, and then next minute it's gone. Yep. Like everything crashing before you.
You lost your job, you lose your housing, somebody you love gets sick, and, you know, like all of those three things, and then your mental health struggles, you're not used to people being kind about that, so, you know, like it's really easy, and I do worry about how the world's going to change.
Absolutely.
Amazing the way they are breaking down stereotypes one conversation at a time. And I'm really pleased to say that one of their colleagues from the 100 Families group is here with us tonight and will be part of the panel. So again, right through this discussion, we have people who really understand this from a very personal insights, and will be able to talk about it. So the 100 Families project is what they call research in action. So in other words, there's no ivory towers here. What you will find is, amongst them, Professor Paul Flatow, who's a leader in this area, at bringing together other thought leaders, including those with lived experience, to develop out-of-the-box solutions to big social challenges like poverty. Paul's the director of the UWA Business School Centre for Social Impact. It's a research, teaching and public engagement centre. And he has made personally a really big contribution to research in homelessness right across Australia. Today he's going to take us through the research findings. Can you give him a big welcome? Thank you.
Thanks, Geraldine, and I'd also like to thank Auntie May Maguire for that wonderful welcome to country, and also acknowledge that we are on Whadjuk Noongar land, and pay my respects to the elders of this land. Also say just what a wonderful project this has been on a very, very difficult topic, collaborative project. So we're looking at poverty in Western Australia, and I'll describe what those circumstances are for West Australians from the 100 Families Project, the research that we've done, and then talk about what needs to change going forward. And that's from the words and lives of the people who are involved in the project. Just make sure this is on. I can use this, I hope. Good. Worked before. As soon as I get my hands on something, you never know what's going to happen. So the phrase action research, this is about the fact that this is not a project that stands still. We are engaged with those with lived experience and services in understanding the situation and developing options for change, and working towards a vision of an economically, socially and culturally just WA moving forward. You might not be able to see this on the screens on your, if you're at home watching this on YouTube or here, but it's a project that's been going on for quite some time. 2018, July 2018, first community conversation where we had people with lived experience of hardship talking about what hardship meant for them, and that framed what we did going forward. And then we did a first round of surveys, and we've been putting out bulletins all the time. So 100familieswa.org.au is where you get all of these resources, a number of reports, a number of bulletins, all of videos as well, one of which you've just seen. And we conducted our first set of interviews prior to COVID-19, and then we were able to get out there when COVID-19 was really hitting in terms of lockdown in WA, and then have subsequently done further work. So it's a really interesting project from the point of view of an understanding of poverty and also the impact of COVID-19. Before getting too much into it, I just want to talk about where we were at when we first began in terms of financial security and income support. If you have a look at this graph, you'll see the top line is the poverty line, and the second line below that is the New Start allowance or job seeker for a couple, 2 children. And then you go down further, the poverty line and the New Start allowance or the job seeker allowance for a single person. And what do you see? There is a significant large gap between the income support payment and the poverty line. The poverty line is way above the income support payment. This is going into COVID-19 prior to the COVID-19 supplement. What we were looking at was very, very harsh conditions in terms of income support for those reliant on income support. What did that mean? Because the majority of those were in the 100 Families Project were either on very, very low wages or on income support. And what that means is compared to the general population, you cannot afford the essentials of life. So you can talk about the poverty line and the meaning of that poverty line, and some people say, well, it's quite arbitrary. It's actually not really, in my view, but in spite of that, you can look at what it means for people's lives. So without a good income, you can't afford to have any savings. So 80% not having any savings at all. It's coming up to Easter. You can't afford the holiday. And you can't afford home contents insurance if you are housed at all, and quite a number of people weren't housed. And dental treatment, these kinds of things where you don't necessarily get free public health support. That's the kind of thing. Health which is costly, dental support, podiatry, these kinds of things. You can't afford the motor vehicle. These are the essentials of life you can't afford. And what we found when we used an international instrument that looked at hunger and food security or insecurity was incredibly high levels of food insecurity. So very low food security, that's talking about hunger and what you can afford to get. You know, you might not necessarily always be hungry, but can you afford to get the right food? No. So 62% were in very low food security. 17% of people surveyed said they or other adults in their family had not eaten for a whole day almost every month in the last 12 months. That's the situation in Western Australia. Interestingly, very different in terms of children. In other words, families were at first feeding their children before they fed themselves as adults. That was a really interesting finding. And you heard from the video impact of debt. Now, the terrible thing about poverty is that you go off and pick up debt that you really can't afford because you're faced with immediate bills and immediate circumstances that you have to pay for, including the horror of payday loans. So 25% were reporting that they were getting payday loans, which I can assure you is the worst interest rate around. What did that mean? It meant high levels of stress. It means stress-related illness. So there's a direct link between poverty and ill health, and then it's cumulative causation. Ill health causes poverty. Poverty causes ill health. It keeps on going around and around. And then it impacts on relationships and the ability to maintain homes. And so there's a direct link between homelessness and poverty established from a very early age. So that was a circumstance, if you like, prior to COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 had a number of very significant negative impacts, and I'll talk about one just shortly. One thing that did happen, of course, was the coronavirus supplement. And that's been reduced, as you know, and ends tomorrow. That will be the last day of that, and we have a very small increase in the base rate. Nothing like the gap between the poverty line and the income support payment. What was really interesting was how that supplement was spent. It was spent largely on getting down some of those overdue bills, some of that debt, and getting good food and those kinds of sources that keep people in poverty. So it was actually used to a very, very good effect. That was one of the positives, if you like, of that period of COVID-19. And one of the negatives was in terms of access to services. Places shut down, so I couldn't get the help that I needed. So that's something that lived experience voice tells us we must be very careful going into lockdown about service access. It's a really critical element to the story. So this is not just about what poverty does in terms of the lives of people, but what we need to do to make change. And what we've done here is just brought together 5 elements that come from the lived experience voice in the 100 Families study itself. So it's not that I've created this list, it really does come from them. And it's about these 5 things. So first off, jobs, the need for employment opportunity and reducing employment barriers. So there's a long list of employment barriers that were referred to by family members during it. Housing and accommodation is fundamental. Secure accommodation at an affordable rate is fundamental. Financial security, and that's where income support comes in, or wages, and this is a critical element of the story. Effective health support, and that includes both those that are experiencing long-term illness, as well as those that are experiencing mental health needs at that time. So these things all come together. And then there's another one, and we can talk about the structural things that need to be changed. So secure accommodation, we can talk about structural elements such as increasing housing supply and increasing the supply of affordable housing. We can talk about getting income support right, closing more of that gap between the poverty line and income support payments. These are structural things that can be done. The last thing is something that really requires the community to be engaged and to treat people with respect. It gets to the sense of belonging and well-being. It gets to the sense of removing social isolation, connecting to people. So poverty is about these large structural things, but it's also a very personal experience, and it's a very isolating experience. And that means that those who are working with those experiencing hardship need to talk to not only those structural factors, but those very personal elements that connect to community, social relations, and personal well-being. So fundamental to that journey out of poverty and to that individual experience that people have. So I'd like to end by again referring to the voices, and we've got so many quotes and so many things that we could refer to. I've just picked up a couple of these. What do you need to be safe and well? A stable, clean home for the girls, and enough money to feed and clothe my girls. So that's getting to income security, housing, and so on. The basic stuff, security, talking about jobs now, somewhere stable to live, again, stable housing, a bit of extra money. The last one, when I'm not scared, reducing fear. And that is speaking to that last element I spoke to, the issues around social isolation, but fear, violence, and so on. These are really important things. If you had to name one thing that would make the biggest positive difference in your life, what would it be? To be free of mental illness. That speaks to the health element again. Working again, wanting to get into jobs, and that's not just about the finance, but contributing to society and being connected. Employment is so fundamental to being connected in the society that we live in. Self-worth and financial help. Seeing my children, that's connecting to one's children. And the last one, because those stories around employment and housing were so fundamental, I'll finish with these ones. Without stable accommodation, I found it impossible to maintain a working or study lifestyle. Lack of secure housing really feeds through to so many things. It's difficult for me to find hours that will work with my childcare responsibilities, and after-school care is so expensive. So childcare, after-school care, and the problems of very low income and being able to meet those kinds of issues. So we've got a lot to go on with the 100 families, and of course the next stage of this work is how we present policies and reforms and a movement for change in Western Australia to end poverty and to move to a just and sustainable society. Thank you.
On our panel, but I'm also sure we have them in the audience too. So love to get your input after we've been going for a while. I'll hand the microphone over. Let me introduce you to our panel. Second from the end, we have Elsie Blay, who's Executive Manager of Strategy and Projects at Rua Community Services. Elsie began her career as a nurse, and she saw the poverty and disadvantage that had people coming back into the ED again and again, and now she works to design services to address this. Louise Giolito is the CEO of WACOS, the Peak Council for WA Community Service Organisations. She's got more than 2 decades of experience in the sector. She is a wonderful advocate, and because of her position has a very unique overview about what is being done and where the gaps are. Lynn James in the middle is a very valued member of the 100 Families Advisory Council and a prime mover, as I understand it, in the Rua Art Group. Len found himself homeless in his late 50s. He spent 2 years on the streets, and he's incredibly generous in sharing his insights from that time. And finally, Sean Phillips from UWA, who's a research and development professional in the human services, particularly interested in collaborative approaches to complex social issues, and he's been involved in the 100 Families project since the very beginning. So can you give them a welcome, please? The 100 Families is all about grounding or trying to get the voices of people with lived experience up to policy level and really hearing what is actually going on. So the best way for us to start tonight, I think, is to do the same. And Len has generously agreed to talk to us about your experience of being on the streets and how it was for you.
Yeah, I just made a few notes. So really it's just a snapshot of 2 years living on the streets. So I just want to give you some idea of what it's like. So I wrote a few notes out and I'll just read them out to you. Sorry. Okay. So what is homelessness? Homelessness is routine. You spend your days going from one place to another that provides free food. You only interact with other homeless people who are doing the same thing. You feel cut off from mainstream society, so your world becomes smaller. Of a night, you try to find somewhere safe to sleep. You never sleep well. Aggression and violence is a part of everyday life. If you are assaulted on the street, you just have to accept it. Reporting it to the police is taboo. The police are seen as the enemy, issuing move-on notices and hassling homeless people. If you spoke to them, you were called a dog. Homelessness is feeling powerless. The same old crap every day with no end in sight. Being set up to fail and made to feel like it's your fault. For example, the tent city at Fremantle. The police giving you a move-on notice. We don't want you here, go over there. No, they don't want you over there either. The City of Perth policy is seen as a big move-on notice. We don't want you here, go over there. There are a number of homeless women on the streets in their 50s and 60s. They do it tough. I sometimes wonder if they have grown-up children who have abandoned them. Would you let your mother live on the streets? So that's just a snapshot of what I've experienced.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I know you've got a lot more to say as we go along. Can I just ask you, though, you've made your way out of that now, you know, that's behind you in a sense. But so why are you speaking out about it? Why are you kind of relive it every time you tell it, don't you?
I do. So I was 58 when I went on the streets. I was on the streets for 2 years. Then I was given accommodation when I was 60. But you know, you're given a place to live, but you're not given a life. So I tried to connect with mainstream, but it's very hard. You know, like you meet people and they say to you, what have you been doing for the last couple of years? Mm. If you say, well, I was homeless on the streets, they look at you as if, oh, there's got to be something wrong with this guy. So I found it very hard to connect and not working. I went back to what I knew, which was the drop-in centres and homeless people that went there. So that was my social life, I guess. And so I've continued to do that, you know, for the last 10, 11 years. And as Geraldine said, I got involved in the art group at Rua. And
so why speak out now? Why tell people about what it's like? Why not leave it behind you?
Well, it's very much a part of my life. I still talk to people on the streets. I guess that's who I relate to. That's who I talk to.
And what do you want other people to know? The people who are not on the streets?
I want other people to know that homeless people, they're still people. When I was on the streets, I'd wake up of a morning, walk into the drop-in centre, I'd have a blanket or a sleeping bag with me, so it was obvious I was homeless. And people would walk to the end of the pavement, you know, almost in the road, you know, with their eyes looking down. They wouldn't look me in the eyes as if I would attack them or something, you know. I was looked at differently. So yeah, why am I speaking out? To shine the light that homeless people are people. And they're people that are struggling, and if they get support, and if they get opportunities, they can turn their life around. You know, people are people.
Yeah, really great way to start. Thank you so much, Len. I wanted to go to those 5 points that were up on the screen that came out of the discussions with the 100 families about what they said needed to change. But just before that, I don't know about you, but I've been listening to the news, you know, it's all around. It's like, oh my God, we're facing a wave of homelessness here in WA. We've got, you know, the rent moratorium ending, the rental market's a disaster. People are being thrown out if they can't meet the rent, or, you know, the property's being sold, and then you've got JobKeeper ending. Can I just ask, particularly you, Louise, what do you see coming? Like, what is, and Elsie, you're in the services, what's happening out there at the moment? And has it hit yet? When's it going to hit? What's it going to look like?
We're already seeing the definite increases in the emergency relief in the food sector, of people coming back to seek support. And the really interesting thing on that front was while we had the doubling of income support, that supplement which doubled it, it was a new wave of people who were coming in to seek support. People could then, who were on income support, who would, you know, it was part of their daily routine, and it's a full-time job living in poverty, of going from one service to the next service to find food, to find emergency relief, to get payment for a bill. They stopped actually accessing the system, but what we actually found was new people who had lost their job, who all had gone on to JobKeeper. And JobKeeper was around $750, which is a lot higher than the current $300 the income support is. And they were struggling. So it was a new wave of people. We know JobKeeper has now come to an end as well. We've got these 3 cliffs all coming together. And CCI are estimating that's about 34,000 businesses just here in WA that are reliant on that. Now, some of them will survive, but some of them won't. And those people who are on income, the JobKeeper, they lose their job and can't find another job, they'll go on income support, which is $300. We know the poverty line's at $450. We've done surveys of people in the community. The majority of people need at least $500 just to keep a roof over their head and pay their bills. And that doesn't even come into account the things that have been said about social isolation and the impact that has on people not being able to socialise, not being able to go and meet a friend for a coffee, or to go out for a friend for a meal, or join a sporting club. So, I mean, that's a really big question. We're really super concerned the crisis that's about to hit an already overstretched community service sector who can't meet the current demand.
Elsie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think absolutely New Start's fundamental to ending this. If we look at people spending their days meeting their immediate needs, like finding food or shelter, how can people be involved in meaningful activity if their whole day is spent meeting their needs? So I think absolutely increasing New Start's fundamental to lifting people out of poverty.
Okay, so let's get to the disrupting part now. So, Louise, you said to me before, we need to rethink income support entirely. What do you mean by that? You're not just talking sort of raising the level?
The very first step is actually raising income support. So what they've actually dropped it back down to now is just over $300. That's absolutely fundamental, but we actually have to rethink the whole income support system. So actually look at the family structure, and so for how many children are being supported on that. People laugh at me when I say this, but Bob Hawke, I think, was a bit of a hero in my eyes. He said he made a commitment in this country no child would live in poverty. He actually had a huge impact on that by seriously raising not only income support but the child support system for parents. Unfortunately, it was the Labor government who actually pulled that apart. So now income support and the support for women on income support drops dramatically when your child is now quite young. So it was actually the Labor government who actually stripped that away. But there's also Commonwealth rent assistance. It doesn't actually take into account where you actually live. So it doesn't look at place or what's actually happening in the market at the moment. We know West Australia is the hardest hit at the moment. We know the increases in the rental market will be absolutely horrendous, and Tasmania is the same. But it's not so bad for some reason in Sydney and Melbourne, but their rents are still really, really high. That's at a federal level, but we also have to look, and this doesn't make me very popular with seniors at all, but the state government has a role and responsibility in this around our concession system. It hasn't been reformed in many, many years, and it's not based on equity and it's not based on need. And a small example, just one example, if you retire in Western Australia at a retirement age, the state government, if you own your own house, they'll pay X amount of dollars of your rates. And if you have a second property out in Dunsborough, they'll pay X amount of dollars in those rates as well. It's a concession. And this is how I get most of my hate mail. I don't get a lot, but I do get hate mail on this one. If you're privileged enough to own a second home, I don't think you should be getting a concession from the state government at all. And I understand, and I don't actually want to remove it for everyone, but it should be based on your income and the income that you were privileged enough to retire on. And I do get back at me, but I've worked hard all my life, therefore I am owed this. I don't doubt people worked hard all their life, but they grew up in an environment where they were able to earn a really decent income and often buy a second home. For our young people today, about a third of our young people are unemployed or underemployed. Having a home at all is just not a reality for them. So times change. We need to reform our whole concession system here in this state as well, based on people's need and equity.
That's pretty strong and very concrete. What else would the rest of you had to add, Sean?
It's a big topic. There's an awful lot of things that have to be considered when you start looking at the policy environment. So if you're talking about income support, that's only a very small part of the overall of what you could call the social support system within Australia. Australia's evolved kind of over the kind of post-war period. We're somewhere between the UK and the US. In terms of actual cash transfers, we're pretty mean compared to the overall OECD average. We're in the bottom third. We're not as bad as the US, but we're not that far above it.
Do you think there's a bit of do you think there's a bit of a disconnect there, that we don't think of ourselves as mean? We think of ourselves as quite a generous country in many ways?
I think it is, but that's only part of the story too, because there's a lot of other things that go into the whole bundle of things that happen. So you've got the federal government responsible for income support and also the whole job network side of things, employment services, etc. Then you've got the state government, which has a whole range of different responsibilities. Each one of those has its own bit to play in how things impact upon people at the lowest rung of the ladder. And so we're really looking at a whole across the board. I mean, Louise has sort of mentioned concessions. That's one issue. You've got to be really careful in this area, though, that if you start focusing on one thing, you wind up with a lot of people that come into it. You've got to actually kind of take the whole thing and be very strategic about where you focus your advocacy energy, if you like, because you can't change too many things at one time.
Is there a problem that federal and state and local are not working together on this?
Yeah, look, I mean, if a good comparison is with New Zealand, because they don't have a state level the way that we do here in Australia. So you'll wind up with kind of all sorts of complexity. The more different players you have in this area, the more complex it is.
But you're big on collaboration. That's been, your sort of modus operandi for a long time. What would you be doing differently?
What would I be doing differently in terms of advocacy, service delivery, community development? These are all different sort of parts of the equation. There's a whole lot of things that you could do. Where we're at with the 100 Families project at the moment is that tomorrow we're basically going to be circulating the first draft of the final report, which is basically trying to raise people awareness of all of the different parts of the equation that we need to be thinking about. Developing strategy is kind of the next point after that. Where do we actually target our energies? In WA, we have a new government. I was at a UWA thing last week, and Colin Burnett was there, and he introduced himself and says, "Hi, I'm Colin, I'm what's left of the Liberal Party." I thought it was very good humour of him to say so. But he also made some very good points. He said, look, even a new government with a mandate and a really strong majority has a limit in the capacity of what they can actually address. So you've got to be very strategic. And from Wacos's point of view, you've got to be at the table to be able to kind of influence the new agenda of government. Where's he going to put where's the WA state government going to put their energy? How can we work with government to progress the agenda? And it's not just government too. It's the community, it's business. It's a whole lot of different kind of components that you could work together and pull together. The reason I'm so interested in collaboration is it's so damn hard, and it's really difficult to get all of these massive bureaucracies to actually pull together.
Can I just take us back to income support though for a minute, because in terms of getting changes there, What do you think has to happen, and what are the points you're putting to the federal government, I guess, in the first instance?
That's a good question, isn't it?
People always say that when they don't want to answer.
Look, I mean, I think it does come down to the ballot box at the end of the day.
And we do have a federal election
We do
coming
have a
up.
federal
Sorry,
election
Louise.
coming up.
I would 100% agree with that. There's been a lot of advocacy in that space, and it's not just the community service sector that's been calling for the raise in income support, or the do-gooders, the kumbayaras, as I've often been called. But a number of economists, the governor of the Reserve Bank, everyone has said it needs to be raised above the poverty line. I mean, you can take the economic argument about the stimulus that it does to the economy, because even if you're still only on $457 a week, I can assure you every cent will be spent back into the economy. But there's also the social aspect, and one of the things that's actually often ignored is the long-term impacts. And that's not just on the adults we have in this equation, but also the children we have in this equation. There has been multiple studies, endless studies about the long-term impacts poverty has on children. By the time they start school, they're several years behind, and I think Rana said it in the film, that we don't all start on an equal playing field. And when you're living in entrenched poverty, especially children, you've got so many hurdles to actually overcome. So it is really important, and I can really, really agree with you. I mean, I just gave concessions as one of the reforms the state government could actually do. But the other thing is the lack of social and affordable housing and investment from multiple governments. In the past 4 years, we've actually lost 1,000 houses in our social housing stock under a Labor government. So there's many, many. What do we actually make as a priority? And putting a roof over someone's head is a priority.
Were you going to chime in there? Oh.
Sorry?
No, I thought you were going to say something there.
I could.
Can I just part, because I do want to get onto housing next, but I sit here and I hear you saying there's been many, many studies on this. You know, you're talking about essentially what people know, but who's the people who know? Is there just this fundamental disconnect between what we know and what gets done? And is it because mainstream Australia doesn't know or doesn't care?
That's a really interesting question. When I say the people know, government actually knows. I mean, there's great organisations like the Telethon Kids Institute, extremely reputable organisations that have done multiple studies on the impact of children and in poverty. These reports are presented and presented and presented. So when we actually talk about the ballot box of what's actually important and sort of the vote that you actually make, just what's happening in Canberra at the moment, the only reason around the gendered issue and sexual violence is because enough people in the broader community, men and women, are standing up and saying this is not good enough. So now we're starting to see change. So the media isn't grabbing on, childhood poverty. If we had a story every night of a child living in poverty and the impact the broader community may care. If little Johnny fell down a well and the fire brigade and ambulance and everybody came to pull him out of that well, that would make front page news and nobody would question the resources that took to get Johnny out of the well. But we're not seeing that, and it's really, really hidden, and the media's not reporting it either.
Maybe we'll come back to that, actually, that whole conversation that needs to change. But I know that you did all want to talk about secure housing. Lynn, can I come to you? When you had actually had your own home many years ago, and you paid that off, and then various things happened and unfortunate circumstances, and then you were homeless, and then you got into some secure housing. What difference did that make?
Well, it made the world a difference. From being on the streets, my health was declining, had trouble with my back, and your health goes down. So when it came up, when housing came up, and I'll just explain how the housing came up. I used to go to Rua, the drop-in centre, and I used to keep myself clean. I didn't look homeless. And a new social worker started there and said to me, "Where do you live?" And I said, "I'm homeless. I've been homeless for the last 2 years." And she said, "Have you got your name down for government housing?" I said, "No." "Why not?" I said, well, I read in the paper that for a single person it's something like a 10-year wait. When you tell a homeless person that there's a 10-year wait, especially if he's 60, like you might as well say 1,000,000 years, you know, so it just seemed just too far away. So she said to me, well, put your name down for government housing and I'll make sure you don't have to wait 10 years. So I put my name down, and then she said to me, you might as well put your name down for community housing as well. I said, well, I don't want to live with anyone else. She said, well, that's not what community housing is. You can put down for both. So I put my name down for both. Because I was over 60, because I got a letter from the doctor to say that my health was declining, I was put on priority, and within 6 weeks I was offered a 2-bedroom unit at Como, and I went out and saw it, and of course I jumped at the opportunity to get off the streets. And funnily enough, the next day I got a phone call. This was community housing that I got the unit at Como. The next day, Homes West rang me and said, oh, we've got a place for you. It's an older 1-bedroom unit at Balga. And I said, no, I'm fine, I've got a place. So that's how I got into the place at Como. I've been there 10, 11 years. And that's all it took, was affordable housing.
And what was the difference to your life within a sort of, I imagine, a fairly short space of time?
Oh, it just transformed my life very quickly. I mean, it's what I needed. You know, to sleep in your own bed. Like, when you're on the streets, you realise how many people are wandering around of a night time. You don't realise. When you go to bed of a night time in your own house, you feel safe. When you sleep on the streets out in the open, it's amazing how many people are walking around of a night time. You don't sleep well. It's more like you're just lapsing into unconsciousness and waking up again. There are noises. You don't feel safe. So, yeah, it's also somewhere where you can keep your possessions. If you're in a squat or whatever, you lose your possessions, you can't keep anything. So, you know, and there was stability there. There was, you know, I could afford the rent, afford to pay the bills, and a little bit of money left over. Yeah, I was happy. Yeah, it changed my life.
So in terms of getting others into housing in this particularly dreadful market, what are the kinds of disruptors that you're all looking at?
I think collaboration's a big one in terms of how we work as a sector. So, you know, what we saw in 50-50 and a housing first approach in terms of not having preconditions to housing. So, you know, housing is a right and we need that first. Once someone's in a house that's affordable and they've got support and that's based on choice and it's where they want in their community, we know that's going to have much more success.
So that's the ideal, isn't it? And you're referring to the 50 Homes, 50 Lives project.
That's right.
Which has been pretty successful, as I understand it.
Absolutely.
People are staying long-term housed.
That's right.
So that's brilliant, but then how do you expand that, given the pressures that we have at the moment? What are the plans?
So I think if we can speak as a sector, working as a service, working together to use our resources in a smarter way. So pooling what we've got and looking at, you know, people don't have complex needs. The system's complex. And so looking at how we can kind of disrupt that, I guess, and understand if there's like a one-door approach. So no matter where you come in, that your needs are met. And whether that needs, you know, supporting you with alcohol and drugs or counselling or supporting you with children or justice, you should have that need met. And you shouldn't have to navigate the system. It should be easy to understand. It should be where you need it.
So you're talking about wraparound services
Absolutely.
that come with the housing, which sounds, again, fantastic. But how do we do that at the moment with the current resources, and where should we be going for the resources that are needed?
I think that's a really good point. Nobody could predicted what has happened to the Perth market. It was difficult before COVID-19. There was properties, but at the lower end it was difficult, but people and the community service sector could still find them. We're actually in a situation at the moment, I'm not sure if anybody's looked at realestate.com, literally houses on the market are there, it's been advertised for 2 days and it's gone. I'm actually looking at buying a different home and it's just, it's actually madness, and the rental rates will be increasing. So we do need to come together and think about innovative ways. I know there's a strategy down in Fremantle, and it's only a small one, but how do we actually upscale this where the local government is giving land, a manufacturer is flat packing houses, so it's flat packs that are going to actually pop up. Rotary's getting involved, and Rotary is they're amazing people. I went to their conference recently and spoke. They're going to do the fit out inside of them, and then there's the community services. And in that particular case, they're talking about doing it for older women, and they're going to be tiny houses. They're not going to be huge, but somebody see somebody.
I'm one of those older women, and I was telling you, do not do that.
Mm-hmm.
Do not do that.
Do not.
Do not do tiny houses for older women.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't meet our needs. We have grandkids. We look after them while mum's at work. We have the family over for Christmas. I've recently looked at the plans for the one in Guildford, and it's not appropriate. It's only temporary anyway. So, and I've been trying to bring my voice forward about that for many, many years. The tiny house thing, people need a home, and you know, I have a lot to say about decision making. Who makes all of these decisions? Because I can't participate. So far as I can find, there's no mechanism for me to put my point of view. And I just think that what you're saying is absolutely not disruptive enough. I really honestly want... Do you know Arnstein's ladder?
No, I don't.
Arnstein's ladder, I won't read it all out, but you can Google it. It places citizen participation in the decision making at the top of a ladder of empowerment. And right at the moment, all the things that you're doing and saying, if you look at the ladder, is right at the bottom, which is things like tokenism and manipulation and stuff like that, which is what, I'm not saying that, it's what Arnstein's saying. But I agree with him, and a lot of people agree with him. I really want the conflict of interest in the way not-for-profits addressed. I really do. A lot of it is tender coming down from government. The raise the rate thing, and affordable housing thing, who made that decision? I disagree with that. I want to see much more than just affordable housing. I want people to have choices in their housing. I want sustainable housing, which is a much fuller model, which includes a whole host of human rights, including people making their own choices. The affordable housing model, the money goes to the developers, and I'm telling you, you are still in the same situation. It's not really a home. You don't have full rights if you are renting.
Can I just stop you there for a second?
Yeah, sorry.
It's so good to hear.
I'm so angry.
I get that, and it sounds like you've reason to be. But can I come back to you perhaps when we're doing the all-in? But I'm glad that you said something, and I think it's really good and timely. So thank you, and I will come back to you.
Thank you.
Can I just respond to that? And thank you. And I'd love to ask more questions, and I'll stop and talk to you afterwards. But the community service sector and others, and I'm not saying it's perfect. What I said about tiny houses is one example, and I 100% agree. It doesn't actually allow, and we need, and through the Alliance to End Homelessness, Shelter WA, the thing about choice, about where people live, when Len was giving the example of a one-bedroom home or a two-bedroom home, people want two-bedroom homes so they can have their children or their grandchildren or people staying with them. Having the diversity of choice is 100%. So that is not the solution for everyone, but it may be the solution for some. But we've got to think outside of just having a one size that actually fits all. So I don't want to hog, but I want to keep talking and finding out ways, providing avenues where you can bring your voice. Because the thing about lived experience and the thing that's different about 100 families is exactly that. It shouldn't have taken this long for asking the simple question of the people who've lived with the experience of poverty and not asking them what needs to change. We haven't done that before.
And I will come back to you, I promise. So just in terms of that, getting this particular lady's voice and others like her heard, if she's not part of the 100 Families group, are there other avenues, or are you looking in the 100 families, are you looking to get their ideas about housing and what it should look like, be like?
Yes, is the short answer to that. More than that, though, what we're looking at now is what's our strategy to embed this work where it needs to be embedded, which is across every strategy that's happening. So whenever there is a strategy that's being developed, the voice of lived experience has a seat at the table and is being heard and respected and valued. Sorry? No, that's not, I agree. And what I'm saying is, how do we actually develop a strategy so that it becomes normal practice instead of it being very patchy? Some organizations do it better than others, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So that's certainly one of the key issues that we're working on. And the interviews that we've been conducting with 100 families, meeting once a fortnight over a year, we didn't set the agenda. We didn't say, tell us about this or tell us about that. We said, what do you want to talk about that's important for us to hear about your experience of living in entrenched disadvantage? We didn't use that term. And we've heard an awful lot. We've got, you know, thousands of hours of audio tapes that we're working our way through, and we're basically summarising those findings, feeding it back to the 10 agencies sitting around the table. And the next step is figuring out, okay, where to from here? What is the strategy? Lynn's read the state homelessness strategy from cover to cover, and actually had some really good points to make about it. I don't know if you were talking about some of those things.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm an example.
Lynn, can you just bring the microphone a bit closer?
Sorry. Yes, I guess I'm an example where, you know, I have had an opportunity to talk about my experiences. You know, 100 families have given me that opportunity, you know, to talk about it. But, you know, what I think, there's a crisis in Western Australia with homelessness. There's a crisis. People want a roof over their head. There's no silver bullet. You know, if people were rushed to Fremantle to live in a tent, you know, I mean, and that's grabbed away from them. Like, you know, there is a crisis and there are a lot of people that are looking for accommodation, for some form of security, somewhere to call home.
Can I ask if the homelessness strategy actually cuts it, do you think? Is it going to change things substantially, or does it need to be, again, disrupted in some way?
Can I jump in there with a bit of kind of historical context? Because I'm the old guy on the panel, and I've been around for a very long time. My first gig in this area was setting up what's called an innovative health services to homeless youth in Adelaide back in 1990, last century, right? And it was in Brian Burdekin's day. He was the Human Rights Commissioner, and he basically said, look, the resources aren't getting out to the organisations that are prepared to try things innovatively enough. So they set up this funding round, and I was taken on as the manager to set this thing up. So I've been doing this whole, you know, kind of developmental role for a very long time. And things are so interconnected. I kind of lost my track there, but the things that I was going to, thought Lynn was going to raise is that when we met after he'd read the strategy, he said, look, talking about ending homelessness, but who's turning off the tap? You know, because if you don't turn off the tap, you're not going to end homelessness. What are the taps for homelessness? Two of the really big ones, and this goes back to my experience in 1990 Adelaide, is that 40%, it was a sobering up unit for homeless young people on the streets under the Public Intoxication Act. So cops would pick kids up, drop them off, we'd look after them, find out the next morning what was actually going on, and then work with the agencies about developing responses to what was needed. And basically 40% of those kids, guess who their guardian was? The minister. They were in care of the minister. Child protection, child support for kids in care was a really big issue. That's one of the taps. Mental health is another really big tap for feeding homelessness into the street. We've been through a 20-year process, at least, of deinstitutionalisation. No one would argue that deinstitutionalisation is not a good thing. Of course it's a good thing. You want people in the least restrictive argument. But every time there's a deinstitutionalisation process, there's never a corresponding reinvestment in community-based support services. That's one of the really big taps of homelessness. So looking at it in terms of homelessness in isolation isn't going to get you far enough. Those are the things that need to be addressed, and they're not currently being addressed. They're acknowledged in the strategy. We need to do something about it. We need to do this. but there's no necessary strategy that goes with it. We're raising the age of support to 21 in WA for a pilot project, I believe. Fantastic initiative. So much more work to be done. One of the other big things about the strategy, before I hog the floor too much, is that one of the big shifts that's happened in the strategy is the shift away from what I used to call greasing the wheels of the revolving door on the shelter system, right? Where NGOs were funded to, support people on the streets. What are you doing to support people on the streets? Well, we're trying to get them into a refuge. Who's funding the refuge? Oh, the department is funding the refuge. And so you're funded by the department to lobby agencies that are funded by the department to provide shelter accommodation, which can only last for a few days, then you're back out on the streets. The shift in focus from the homelessness strategy is to focus on housing first. You need a roof over your head, not a kind of 2-night pass to an emergency accommodation. So there's been some changes. That's not necessarily saying it's the silver bullet that's going to solve everything, but that's a pretty big step, and it's a good step. But, it's still baby steps, and there's an awful lot more that needs to be done. So.
I think just one of the other taps there is family and domestic violence. Absolutely. That we know we need to turn off, and looking at how our services can be flexible. If someone's experiencing homelessness or they're experiencing family and domestic violence, the two are likely linked, and other issues as well. So it's about how we can make sure our services, people come into a service and they have their needs met, depending on what they are for the individual, following them along their journey.
Just on that and the development of the homelessness strategy here in this state, I agree, it's not the silver bullet, and it's far from perfect. And the organisations actually involved realised that when we talk about talking with people with lived experience, they didn't do enough in their consultation space with Aboriginal people. So that's carrying on. But there was what the needs of young people was so different to older people or people with children. And that's what the strategies try to reflect about the needs and listening to the voices of people in the communities. I think one of the biggest problems we have, though, is A, the housing market that we know is absolutely atrocious at the moment, but B, also the lack of investment from the state government to actually implement the strategy. So there's a whole bunch of strategies out there at the moment, but there's no funding to implement them, or little.
And with the mandate that the McGowan government now has, is that an opportunity for them to actually implement this?
Certainly is, and we've got apparently a pretty big war chest in terms of how well the state's been doing in terms of resources. So there's some great opportunities. There's not really much of an opposition, though, in terms of keeping them honest and keeping them moving ahead. So that's our job, right?
Just going back to the point that this lady brought up about the housing that you were talking about, Louise, not being appropriate. It sounds fantastic that this group is coming together and developing something, and got inputs from the community. Was there the voice of lived experience in there? Like, is that kind of an ad hoc thing that's happening over there, and it's fantastic intentions and everybody's coming together, but it's not based on, it's not linked to the homelessness strategy, and it's got the sort of chance of perhaps not meeting the needs of the people it's meant to be?
I think the voices of people with lived experience in the homelessness space is getting a lot stronger, and those voices are coming in. One of the things that's happened over many, many years, and the more and more that we've moved into this competitive tendering environment, is organisations have had to compete for money, and it's often, the price at the lowest or the organisation at the lowest actually wins the bid. So, but what that's actually done is the community service sector should be part of the community. It shouldn't be something separate to the community. In some respects, we've gone so far that you've got government that's a big bureaucracy, and then you've got community service sector that sometimes, not always, but sometimes sit outside the community service sector and is not bringing those voices of the lived experience in. In regional WA, especially small community neighbourhood centres, they're so embedded in the community, you can feel it when you actually go there. But that's not always the truth. So voices have been included, but not everyone's voice. So it's improving, but it's not perfect.
I think we'll probably come back to housing. I do want to move on, but just one last question. I think it was you, Louise, who said to me before this that this is on the scale of a crisis like a bushfire, like a flood, and that in fact we should be responding to it that way in terms of housing. What did you mean by that?
we're really scared of the level of people who are going to be without a home very, very, very soon. And these are people who have never been part of the welfare system, so to speak. That, you know, we're hearing prices that rent's going up $100 a week, $150 a week. What will actually happen then? We don't want tent cities. We know that they're actually unsafe. The solution is proper housing for these people, but it's not there immediately. There simply isn't the houses here in WA. So conversations have actually started, and I'm not saying we are there yet, but do we have to set up a crisis emergency centres for people to actually go, if they've got the choice between living in a tent on the street, living in their car, because they literally have nowhere to go? How are we going to actually respond to this? It's really frightening. It's frightening now already. For so many people, it's just going to get worse.
But you're suggesting, are you not, that we need almost like crisis evacuation centres where people can live temporarily?
I'm not suggesting that. What I'm saying is we might actually get to that point. I don't know if we're actually there yet, but when we're going to start looking at the choices of what's the option, is more women going to be sleeping in their cars with their children? Are they going to be couch surfing if they don't have any if they can't couch surf? We're really, really concerned about the possible growing level of homelessness, of people absolutely having nowhere to go but the street or their car if they've got a car.
I was talking to a friend today who lost their house in the recent fires, and I found out that Minderoo have been doing these pods for people, where they place the pods on land. So I don't know that it has anything to do with that, but I was just interested that, you know, an organisation had come up with a temporary kind of fix to when it's considered like a crisis. Yeah. And you're saying that that's what this is. Can we talk about jobs? Sean, you said that that, you know, quote that's been around for a long time, that getting a job is the best form of welfare. Where are we at in terms of assisting people with employment, and how do you do that when there are people at so many different stages and levels? And
I think from my point of view, the thing that I'm seeing at the moment that's the most relevant to this, a really well-known economist, Ross Garnaut, has come out recently challenging the way that we're thinking about unemployment in Australia. And basically it goes like this. They now measure unemployment, or not exactly unemployment, but they measure what they call the NAIRU, N-A-I-R-U, which is the non-accelerating interest rate of unemployment. So the issue is, this is the rate that unemployment can grow to or can come down to before inflation starts to kick in, and you know we start and job kind of
do you mean that we always need to have sort of this level of unemployment so that we're not going into inflation? So it's sort of in our interest to keep some people permanently unemployed.
Exactly, and they think it's around 6.5%. Now, if you look historically, between the 40s or the 50s and the 70s, the unemployment rate in Australia, what was seen to be a normal or an acceptable rate of unemployment was about 2%, you know, and now it's 6.5%. We also estimate that's about 4% of the population that are in entrenched disadvantage, about the same amount of people. So the issue that Garnaut is raising is that what happened here, and how can we justify this situation where 6.5% of our population are acceptably unemployed from a kind of macro perspective, you know, and that's okay because it's keeping inflation down, you know. That's horrible. That's a really terrible situation to be in. And not only that, it's kind of a bit of a guess. With a lot that we could do to try to reduce it back down to 2%, before, you know, the inflation genie gets out of the bottle. So that's the kind of public debate that's happening around this stuff at the moment, and I think it's a really good one. But to me, that's just an indication too of, you know, the fact that we're able to accept this high level of unemployment, which is really brutalising people's lives, raises the question about how serious we are about getting people in jobs in the first place. If we say that's the best form of welfare, but we're not putting any investment into active labour market programs, which if you go travel around Western Europe and places like that, you'll see that these are kind of normal. You know, if somebody's unemployed, you do everything you can to support them to get back into the workforce. They also often have things like contribution-based unemployment schemes. Canada had it 40 years ago. Australia decided not to adopt it in the post-war period. There's all sorts of things that can be done in this space that we're not even trying to do. And basically, what are we doing at the federal level? We're basically blaming people for being on welfare benefits. You know, we're calling them dole bludgers, shovel leaners. The age of entitlement is over. Shall I go on? I'm sure you've heard most of them.
And at the moment, you were all telling me about if you get New Start or Job Seeker or whatever it is, you have to apply for how many jobs per month?
20 a month now. Yeah.
20 a month. And there are...
It's a full-time job.
It's a full-time job and there aren't that many positions. Sorry, Lynn.
Yeah, I was just going to say that even when you're homeless, if you're on New Start, you have to look for work, you know. So for the 2 years that I was homeless, I had to look for work and put in a form.
And what was that experience like?
Well, you know, it's just a feature. I mean, it's hard enough to compete against other people trying to get work, but when you come in from a base where you're homeless, where you're sleeping in a squat, it seems futile.
Mm. So Sean, you're saying that there, you know, in Western Europe you cited there are lots of examples of how people come around people who are unemployed. So why are we not doing that here?
Look, one of the hardest things with policy analysis is to figure out what the intent behind the policy really is. But everything that I've seen really looks to me that the idea is if we just get tougher on people who are on welfare benefits, that will encourage them to try harder to get into jobs which allegedly are there and available for anybody who wants them. Louise can talk about some of the things to do with, you know, kind of strategies that have tried to encourage people to go off and fruit pick. I just saw another article about a young woman who was sexually molested while she was fruit picking in one of these places. All sorts of issues around it. But, yeah.
Could we also look at, you know, I found that when I was on the streets, there were people that had, you know, that were chronic alcoholics and been on the streets for 20 years. And I would talk to them and they tell me they're on New Start. So there are a lot of people on New Start that should be on a disability pension. They have no chance of ever getting a job. You know, I think that has to be considered too.
Mm. I had promised that we would get to questions from you all, and I know you have got a lot to say and a lot to ask. So I'm going to just sort of interrupt our flow for the moment, if you don't mind, to throw it open to the floor, because I think we're going to get some great questions and some great comments. I promised this lady over here that I would come back to you, but I'm going to go further afield first, if you don't mind. We've got some roving microphones, or a roving microphone down there. Yep, one up the front and one in the middle. Would anybody like to jump in at this point? And it doesn't have to be on jobs. Yes, gentleman down the back.
Just going to say, after COVID, something's going to be missing over the next decade. That's called a full-time job.
So you're saying the effects of COVID will be that many people don't have full-time jobs? Is that what you were saying? Yep.
If you have a look at the disasters about to happen, how is it going to improve in 10 years? It's just not going to happen.
Mm.
We were well and truly seeing that before COVID, the absolute growth in underemployment. And again, I can talk about the statistics around young people. A third of young people, that's a huge amount, are underemployed or unemployed. It's impacted women more than what it has actually men in the service industry. When COVID hit, that was women and young people were hit the hardest with COVID when we talk about jobs, because they worked in the hospitality service industries, and you know they were the industries first to shut down. We're seeing it pick back up, but we really have to rethink our whole industrial relations and how people are actually supported. We have plenty of working poor people in Western Australia, so it's not just income support, and 100 families have actually proven that as well. Many of these families who have been part of this project are working, but they're well and truly working poor.
What about some of the things that are happening over in Victoria? And if I'm understanding this rightly, the Victorian government has a social procurement arrangement over there, it's probably not the right word, where a certain percentage of new contracts, particularly say the construction industry, have to be farmed out to social enterprises. And those social enterprises actually bring in people who are out of work. They might be upskilling them, and the idea is to transition them through, not for them to end up there endlessly. Is that happening here? Is that the sort of thing that is useful?
when the state government introduced their recovery package, I'm trying to keep my terms right, they introduced that. So most of what they introduced in their recovery package was out of 420 policies or positions, about 360 or 370 were in the construction industry. And they put quotas in that construction industry around employing young people in traineeships and apprenticeships, employing women. They missed the mark in that particular space, and that's part of the problem where we're at now about building and construction, because it's happening in a whole bunch of areas, which is not in housing but building other things. The construction industry haven't been able to get their act together for at least 10 years in relation to 10, 20, 30 years, in relation to gender equity and attracting more women into that industry. So I don't know how they thought they were going to turn it around in 6 months and women be attracted into that industry. And I'm not saying women shouldn't go into that industry, please don't get me wrong there. If that's the path they actually want to take, they should. But there should have been investment into industries where the majority of people were women, in our health and our caring industry, where we know there's jobs growth, and there was no investment there. But they have introduced quotas in those areas in a lot of state government contracts, which is a good thing. I do want to say it's a good thing. It's just where they invested all their money.
Other questions from the floor? Yes, person at the back.
Thanks. My name is Mchabazi. The question is, just following up what Sean said, how would you propose taking out changing the narrative around punitive nature for welfare payments, so things like work for the dole, and such that these things are not politicized anymore and people actually see it as a social problem, as not something to use to garner votes come election time?
Great question.
Changing the narrative being the main point in that. I guess we see the 100 Families Project as being all about changing the narrative. So the video that you saw before, the reports that are coming out, what we're learning from listening to the voice of lived experience. One of the most profound experiences in my life has been working with the stories of the 100 people that we've been interviewing once a fortnight. Some horrific stories, some amazing stories, all sorts of stories, but at the end of the day, all of your stereotypes are gone, because there isn't just one type of person that fits into this category. It's all types of person, and it could just as easily be you or I. So that's kind of very much at the very heart of it. I was going to save this for later, but the thing that really impressed me just the other day, I went to a UWA thing, and there was somebody talking about some research they'd done where they were talking about values. They were talking about values in WA, very recent research, very good size sample and really good methodology and everything. And they were reporting on what the values are that everybody holds in WA. And a pie chart of 10 different values, all sort of grouped into different categories. The top 2 values were benevolence and universalism. This is what people said were their top values. You know, benevolence in terms, a few different sort of subsets of it, but it was really about concern for other people's well-being. Universal, being concerned for everybody's well-being. These are our values. Then why don't we vote that way? At the end of the day, when it comes to the ballot box, the pollsters and everybody who's the commentators is looking at it, and people tend to typically vote for what affects them as an individual. So there's a disconnect between the things that we actually value, and I don't doubt the results of the survey. I actually think it's really probably right, and I think it's really profound. But the disconnect is between what we say we believe and what we actually do at the end of the day. How you then mobilize that becomes a question of strategy. And for us, it's the question of strategy for the 100 Families Project. Where is it going to go? You need to be able to create a movement. You can't just wait for government to do this. We've had 20 years of neoliberal policy driving us at the national agenda. You've got to be able to create a movement that's not just about moving and influencing a particular politician or a particular party, but it's got to basically be made up of a really broad cross-section of the community, of the business community, the NGO community, the startup community, social enterprise community, as many allies as you can, because these are our core values. These are the things we say we believe in. So we've got to create spaces to mobilize that.
And your question is the same as mine. How do you do that so that you are not constantly speaking to people inside the tent? Because those stories are fantastic, but where are they going? How are they getting out there?
a very good question.
Another one.
Once again, you're a good question asker, aren't you?
Yes, the lady over here.
It's fair enough to give people a voice, but somehow we need to school people to listen and to hear. And there's been a couple of things that have been said on the panel that are actually, not that you've been contradicting yourselves, but you've shown that there's a lot of contradiction around, and we certainly see that in our political system. And I think, Louise, you mentioned that the stuff with women and Canberra came from the voice of, I think you said something like average women or normal women. Well, it's not average women, and it's not normal women, and it's not in an average place, which is why it's getting the momentum that it's getting now. And average women are joining it and joining their voice to it. So at some point we have to, and I think it comes back to values. You know, we don't have any values in the political system, and people's disconnect with their values is, it all follows through. It's like there's a foundation that needs to be laid before these strategies can actually take root. I mean, I've worked in the state sector, the not-for-profit sector for years, and have seen so many good programs just be bowled over because they just need to look good on paper from a political and government point of view, and then they do their good work, and then they just dissipate and disappear, and it's all over.
Can I answer? I think what we've seen throughout time in politics, and it's not just this time, but I don't think big disruption or change actually comes out of government. It's led by the community, and the community comes first. Government sees it's popular, and then it follows. And I think we're starting to see that with climate action. I think we've seen that with marriage equality. The government was so far behind, but the community, so the leadership comes from the community. Government is the late adopters, so it's getting that community on board is what will make the change.
So one of the strategies is helping the community hear it, because we do live in, many of us are very privileged, and we're actually quite blind to the prejudices that we carry.
Previous job of mine was, I hesitate to mention this because you may all hate me, but I was the WA coordinator for the Every Australian Counts campaign, which was the campaign to get the NDIS, which is why I think you might hate me. Believe me, the NDIS we fought for, we did not get, and people are still fighting, which is terrible. But one of the things at the beginning, we were led by an ex-politician, and they made it very clear that we had to target the politicians through community groups. So it was the old-fashioned kind of grassroots thing. But in the beginning, and it was always going to be bipartisan. And it sounds naff, but you know, we did a lot of work, but we mobilised people to go visit politicians. And in the beginning, I must admit, I wasn't part of that kind of experience. It worked. It worked because by the end, and we did it leading up to an election, the politicians were ringing us saying, you haven't put your Every Australian Counts sticker on my website, and people are ringing us. So again, it's not a perfect campaign and it wasn't a perfect result, but it did change, and it was mobilising the people with the voices who then brought the people around them and then went to the politicians, and yeah, for what it's worth. Anyway, other questions, comments? Looking down there, yes.
For me, excuse me, I've just forgotten your name, Professor
Sean.
Sean. I really love what you're doing. I love your collaborative approach, especially to research and to link research with policy. I'm thinking that you have a great opportunity here to get this thing moving. I don't know how long you've been going already.
Well, we first started talking about
2018.
2016.
2016.
Yeah, it took us 2 years to
You
get
say
funding,
earlier something about a start
yeah.
in 2018.
That's when Lottery West funded the project.
So I just want to ask the question here. When you report back your interview results to a round table, what representatives are at that round table?
That's a good question too. Might ask someone from West Aussies to respond to that. Probably Louise, you got some ideas about, because we've got 2 roundtables that are actually being scheduled, being planned for probably June this year. One for government and one for community, maybe.
Yeah, we get.
Hello, everybody. So, the timeline that Professor Flateau put up earlier was for the research part. Although it's action research, it's still research. So this leads us up to June, which is when the full report is going to be released. So we're doing our best to get the information out there, but the doing part at a real practical level needs to come next. So in June we release, we have a round table, we have two. So one is for the community service sector, one is for government, and we currently are inviting ministers, and all the big players, director generals, etc., to come and listen, to be part of that conversation. The next step, though, beyond that, and this is pending funding, because that's always the problem, is more of the doing. So we want to start doing the mapping. I think, Sean, you mentioned that earlier, to make sure lived experience is not in this standalone document, but is linked to every other strategy out there. Families are saying this isn't working or this is working. We want to amplify those voices in other areas. The other things we want to do is more of training and workshopping, making sure people know the information. That you've only really got a tiny bit today. There's so much to tell. So make sure it's out there and it's workshopped so it's integrated into service. And when I say service, I should probably say support, because not everybody wants a service. Sometimes they want to do it their way with support. They don't want to necessarily walk through a door in some unknown place to get their needs met. They might want to do it, and largely they do, in community for themselves in the way that feels right for them. And the last thing, well, there's two other things actually. One of the other things we want to do is to reimagine the system and the supports that we're giving. So a new blueprint of what support looks like. That will be, like everything else we've done, co-designed. So when you mentioned Ansel's ladder of participation, I work strongly with that. We make sure that we're always at the co-design or above level. None of this tokenism, which we all sometimes are guilty of falling into, but we always correct it. That's what we need to push. So some of the stuff you see on the back page of this is listen to us. So we need to make sure what I call community advisory groups or consumer advisory groups, whatever we want to call it, lived experience is everywhere. It's not an added extra. It's not a thing we consider. It's always there. So we make sure we're working with those people who are impacted. We're not projecting their needs onto them. We hear about their needs from them themselves. So that's a challenge with government. There's always, challenges there, but hence why we want to try and reach out to the general public, because there's so much untapped power here. And as Sean and the others have said, it's about, having a voice and making sure that you speak up in your communities, because that will have a ripple effect. And if it goes through to voting, then please do. The last thing we want to do, and this is just a quick mention, is make sure that the Aboriginal voice is represented well. So 1/3 of the families in this were Aboriginal. We will definitely include all the results in the full report, but we feel that their voice, because of the uniqueness, because of their own experiences, needs to be told in a different way by them. So that's something else we want to do. And I know tonight we focus quite a lot on housing and homelessness, which is essential. So 17% of the families are homeless, but 52% have been homeless at some point in their life, so it's huge. When we talk about domestic violence, one of the leading causes of domestic violence, one of the leading outcomes is women leaving a violent relationship into homelessness. It's a barrier. Sometimes they have to stay, or they choose to. So there's so many other areas. We didn't talk about grandparent carers who didn't envisage looking after their grandkids, who are having to stretch their pensions. We don't talk about some of the other many issues, but it's such a quick conversation. So that's the future. Like I said earlier, if you want to subscribe to our Facebook page, go onto our website and follow us, put in your email address, then we'll tell you more and we can, help spread the word.
Thank you, Alex. I did promise I would come back to you, and I'd like to ask you specifically to tell us what you were talking housing, what it is that you want us to know about what you and other women you know need and want.
So we want to choose our own housing, and there's no model for that at all. And I've tried to engage with that for years. We want to stay in our own homes. I mean, I was ripped out of my home when I had cancer. That is absolutely not acceptable. Absolutely not acceptable. I was treated like it was, you know, like a character flaw. We want to be in control of our own lives, and the system is very controlling. It's, you know, if you went from a domestic violence relationship where your husband was into the coercive control type stuff into the welfare system, you are into a coercive control environment. I mean, I was breached by Centrelink multiple times when I had cancer. It just, you know, we need a much deeper analysis of what's going on, even in this room. There's so much I want to say, and there's not time for it.
Well, I'd invite you to connect with the speakers afterwards, because I'm sure they'll probably
I'll just finish up with one thing about neoliberalism, which is most of us now, even capitalists, are saying that's a problem. That the organisational structures of the organisations that do the not-for-profits are based on that model. And it just leaves us, who are supposed to be served and supported and everything, as the product or the raw material or whatever it is. No, I just reject that totally. I want to have a say in the decision-making process, and I especially want to be in control of my own life. And if I say no to something, instead of the person at the other end of the desk ringing the bell to get the security officer, I expect to be heard and listened to and accommodated. Because do you know what? I'm 65. I'm a strong woman, educated woman. I can damn well look after myself. I don't need all of this stuff. I just need to be able to get on with my own life.
Okay.
And as we all are, can I tell you?
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. I do need to wrap up this session, and I want to get the panel to have the final word, but are there any burning questions before I throw back to... Yes, burning question here.
Hi everyone. It's not a question, it's just a big thank you. A couple of years ago I came to the festival and I met Lynn and we went on a tour. And this is, I think, where it all starts, being privileged in a sense and knowing that my life could change any time for any reasons. I was able to go on a tour and ask all the questions that I wanted to. How did you end up like this? How old were you? How did you feed yourself? Were you scared? Danger, drugs, alcohol, anything like that. And that was actually the very first time that there was no segregation. I had the freedom to actually be part of the tour with someone who was able to talk about his experience. So that's why I came back, and I just wanted to say a big thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to end by asking each of you to throw out a challenge to whatever particular section of the community or government you feel like should step up to change things. Louise, I'm going to put you in the hot seat first.
I'm always talking about government because that's where my work sits, in advocacy and policy with government. But I can't get out of the thought at the moment about what's happening out there in the community around the rental moratorium coming to an end, and there's so many people that are doing it. It's so tough in our community and it's just going to get worse. So if you know of anyone who's privileged enough to actually have a second property and they're renting it out, ask them about what they're going to do and how they're going to be part of the community solution and community problem, and about, are they going to be hiking up their rents? Are they going to be, putting people at risk and making them homeless? REWA Real Estate Institute has a very different take on this than us, that, the rental market's been stable and people have to, pay their mortgages, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that there's a moral compass we actually all have in this space. And I've heard of some people who own a second property have got really angry with their real estate agent because they've sent a letter saying we're going to up your rent, and they've come back and said, no, I don't want you to up the rent. I like my tenant. They're great. They're fantastic. So, yeah, that would be my big ask at the moment. We all have a responsibility all the time, but especially at the moment.
Thank you. Elsie?
I think it would be to continue the conversation so all of us here care so much, and understanding the drivers of domestic violence or homelessness or poverty, and that we continue challenging that, whether it's with our neighbours or colleagues, and that we continue to drive the change for break down the stigma and discrimination.
I'm going to skip over you, Lynn, because I'm leaving you for last. Sean?
Well, I already kind of blew it with talking about values before.
I'm sure you've got a few different challenges up your sleeve.
Look, I guess the thing that really comes to mind now that I've given that one away is that the best thing that, well, the most important thing I can ask you to do is to stay in touch with the project. We need an army, and the more diverse that army is, the better. So if you know anybody if anybody's a friend of Sam Walsh or something, give him a call. I know he's kind of really interested in social issues. Or anybody else you know in the kind of big end of town who might have a heart for getting involved in something like this, start talking to them about it, because that's what we actually need if we're going to affect any change.
And Lynn, we started with you. I'd really like to finish it with you. What's your challenge?
Okay, so the way I'd like to end it, I'll go back to the tent city at Fremantle. So I do wonder about Mark McGowan. He said the people down there weren't homeless. They were agitators, they were activists, and he publicly said, these are not homeless people. I just want to say, they were homeless people. And I think Brewer actually did a survey and found something like 85% of the people were homeless. So you do wonder whether there's a political will. Nothing will happen if you live in denial and you say, I think Mark McGowan actually came out and said to the people who were feeding the homeless, stop meddling. We've got this. We're giving you a big move on notice. It's not helpful. We need political will. We have a crisis. There are women on the streets, there are men, and they're suffering and they're beaten down and they don't have a voice. I'd just like to end on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. So thanks to our wonderful panel, and thanks to you. You've been a fantastic audience. You've really given us pause for thought, I think, with some of the questions and the comments that you've raised. And I'm glad you did so. This is obviously one in many conversations and hopefully the beginning of something. Thank you for being part of it. Thank you so much.
I'm going to take this off.